welcome to another episode of the Crisis Response Podcast. Today, I am joined by Jeff Schlegelmilch, the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University and the author of Rethinking Readiness, a brief guide to 21st century megadisasters. Thank you so much for joining us, Jeff. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me, Jason. Always great to catch up and talk to you.
Absolutely. So let's start off with your work with the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University. What do you do at the National Center? What does that entail?
Yeah, that's a legitimate question, and that deserves an answer one of these days. No, and yeah, it's a very encompassing title. And being based in academia, of course, one of the first things that comes to mind is research, and that's one component of what we do. And going way back, though the center was actually really born in the post 9/11 days, where there was a need for translation of research into policy and practice. So the center was originally founded before my time, founded by Dr. Irwin Redlener, a pediatrician and children's advocate, and was founded at the School of Public Health with some of the bioterrorism curriculum development funding and the Centers for Public Health Preparedness. So it really had this focus on, there are all these medical questions and public health questions. One of the ones that our center famously worked on back then was pediatric doses for exposure to weaponized anthrax, And here's something that has a very operational need to be informed. At the time, we were worried about anthrax attacks anywhere in the country. There's not a lot of good data on, infants exposed to weaponized inhalational anthrax and the proper dose of antibiotics. It's a good thing we don't have that data, but something that emergency departments were wrestling with. So we would do things like hold consensus conferences, bring physicians, bring scientists into a room and say, look, we don't have the answer, but we have the pieces of the answer. We know things like what antibiotics you would give an infant, what antibiotics anthrax is generally susceptible to. And so we can piece together interim recommendations until the unlikely event that there's more data available and can augment from there. So I think that's a really shining example of the impact orientation from the very origins of the center. Over the years, the portfolio grew and the balance of research, policy, and practice sort of ebbs and flows depending on the scope of the portfolio we're working on. Years later, again, before I joined, it moved over to the Earth Institute, which is now part of the Columbia Climate School. And there were a variety of reasons linking things to climate change, looking at an all-hazards environment. I came to the center and started as a managing director and then deputy director and took over about 2.5 years ago. Irwin is still a senior research scholar and doing some great work with the center, but there was a leadership transition and I formally took over, and the center continues to follow in the enormous footsteps that he left of creating and contributing to the evidence base as much as possible, but no matter where the research comes from, making sure that end state is not in a journal on the shelf, but is actually working its way into the contemporary issues of policy and practice. And we do that through training, we do it through advisory roles, we do it through consultative roles, and now working with developing new collegiate courses and executive education courses and things through the newly formed climate school at Columbia University.
Wow. So you start in the post 9/11 period, focused on anthrax and the impact on children, which is a very specific, though, like you said at the time, practical area of research. Where have you gone since then? Because obviously that's not at the top of people's concern list anymore. Where did you go from there?
Yeah, and it's a good question. And the example given is just one. There were a lot of other sort of health and medical type of questions like that we were addressing, but absolutely, I mean, over the years that sort of grows as we expand into community. There were a number of landmark research projects the center did looking at following cohorts of children and families exposed to some of the disasters that followed: Hurricane Katrina, the Gulf oil spill, Hurricane Sandy. What are the long-term and short-term health and mental health effects? And then as we sort of grow and we're looking at things, and expand further and further into the community, we inevitably start looking at, well, okay, we've observed these trends. Now, how do we actually work with the whole community? If we know children are connected to all these parts of the community, how do we start to engineer solutions? Or maybe that's not the right word. Bring the community assets to the table that have these capacities and help in processes to build coalitions that are oriented towards meeting the needs of children in disasters. And actually, a grant we had from GSK was very instrumental through our Resilient Children and Resilient Communities initiative to sort of take all these observations and all this research on the connectedness of children with their communities and then look at who are the institutions that serve children every day, who are the institutions responsible for responding to disasters, and how can we help connect and translate the evidence base into tools and resources that are usable. And that's evolved as well, too, into more and more work with the private sector. We've worked with utilities, we've worked with financial firms who are very similarly have questions on, okay, if there are grid outages in different neighborhoods, what's the impact? If there are investments that could be made to help offset losses in the future to things like flooding or increased rainfall or increased wildfire risk, what is it that we need to know? And so it's a very challenging time with the disasters that we face, but it's also, I would say, more engaged across different sectors, trying to work together and seek out answers than ever before. So yeah, it's funny, you look back on the work of the center and the portfolio, and it's like looking back at photos in the family photo book, right? You're like, oh, where did all the time go? But as you're going through it, it's a very sort of logical progression, sort of expanding the work that you're doing and reaching out with other folks and just trying to connect the dots and for us to learn as much as we're contributing as well too. We can contribute what we know from the science and what we know from our experiences, but we also have a tremendous opportunity to learn if a company in the private sector is trying to sell within their company more investments in resilience, more investments in climate mitigation and climate adaptation. What's the kind of data that's more useful in their world and in their context? And the same goes for individuals. If we want individuals to be more prepared, if we want communities to be more resilient, it's not going to come from a spreadsheet likely, or it's not going to come from, something in a journal, in an academic journal. How do we take the information out of that and turn it into something that can be integrated into the way people make decisions every day, whether at home, whether at work, whether in their groups in the community?
So you're talking about connecting the dots and looking back on your portfolio. And clearly one way that you connected all the dots was in your book, Rethinking Readiness, A Brief Guide to 21st Century Megadisasters. How did this book come about? What was it that inspired you to write this, and what were you trying to achieve? Because it's quite an impressive book with a lot of interesting scenarios and use cases. And I'm just wondering what led to that.
Yeah, I'd love to say it came to me in a moment of brilliance or it came to me in a dream, but really it came to me in a conversation with Erwin. And, we were talking about different ideas and some different things of looking at the future. And it was actually originally from Erwin, the specific sort of categories that were outlined in the book. So we were both talking about, like, look, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but we know there are certain trends, there are certain disasters where human activity is driving both the threat, the bad thing that, is trying to happen, and the underlying vulnerability. Climate change is an example, pumping, greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And so increasing the risk of the consequences, but then also building in floodplains or in vulnerable areas. So sharpening the blade on both sides. And Erwin had this enumeration of things in the topics that are covered, which are biothreats, including pandemics, climate change, infrastructure failure, cyber threats, and nuclear conflict. And so as we sort of talk through the book and talk through what each of these topics was, it became an incredible sort of framing of if somebody comes to you and says, what do I need to know about disasters and what we face in the 21st century, that this would be a starting point to be able to say, well, look, here are the kinds of threats we face. Here are some of the different dynamics. And then from here, you can deep dive into different areas and read additional books and articles and things. But sort of, if I want to wrap my head around this, what can we do and what are we facing? That was sort of the intent of really putting this all together in one place. And I'm certainly indebted to Erwin for really kind of the breakthrough with sort of those framing elements that the book is shaped after.
Clearly, and the timing of it, it was published in mid 2020, but it takes a while to go from final draft to publication. I'm interested, how did your perspective on pandemics and whatnot change once COVID started? I mean, was it reading the book like, yep, this is exactly, we predicted this, or were there a lot of things that you didn't foresee happening?
Yeah, so the book was done and was submitted in final draft, final version just needed copy editing and things like that. And I believe it was in December. It was late 2019. And then we were going through the process. Maybe it was even early 2020, but essentially it was in the production process when COVID really emerged as something suspicious, and then ultimately into what we now know as the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we had this conversation with the editors at Columbia University Press, and they took it back, and we had some conversations, and really we were sort of at an inflection point. What do we do with a book like this at a time like this? Do we rush it, or do we hold off and revise it after the pandemic? Well, no telling how long the pandemic was going to go. And as I was rereading the pandemic chapters and what the experts had to say, I was like, this is actually important for the pandemic and important for how we frame it and how we look at recovery from it. So in consultation with Columbia University Press and really through their support, we rushed publication and actually had it. I believe the official publication date was in September, but it was available in various forms in June of 2020. But to get to your question more precisely, what we ended up doing was putting a preface at the beginning of the book, kind of talking about the pandemic and acknowledging it and looking at sort of how the book plays into this and these overarching themes. I think in broad strokes, I wouldn't change much because the overall themes were what played out. And unfortunately, that's no accident. We have the history of how pandemics play out, and we have the experts who are involved with planning who knew the shortcomings. But if there were two things that I would do differently if I were to write the book now, one is I would put more attention at the importance of politics in pandemics, which has always been a feature in pandemics, but obviously we saw that up close and personal. And I think a number of people were shocked at the level of politics in the pandemic, which looking at the history books is not necessarily something that should have been such a shock. It's not unusual in things of this nature to have the level of political intervention that we had seen and continue to see to this day. And the other are the issues of equity that really came to light in a lot of the racial reckoning over the last several years. There was some discussion of equity in disasters and inequity in disasters, but I think that in a very important way that has come to light through a number of activists and is probably deserving of even more attention in really any text focused on disasters. So yeah, I don't think we missed anything between the editors, the reviewers, and myself, but there are some things I think maybe would have added some more words and some more references and some more insights on.
That's really interesting, the politicization of disaster response and getting involved. I think it goes without saying that funding for disaster preparedness usually happens retrospectively, right? After 9/11 was probably the biggest, and correct me if I'm wrong, but from my perspective, after 9/11 was the biggest infusion of support for public safety and emergency response systems. And then the farther we got away from 9/11, the more that funding decreased. I'm wondering, with these ebbs and flows of funding for disaster preparedness and response mechanism and infrastructure, what are the big challenges that communities are facing, and what are some ways that they can deal with that? I find it, again, very in our work, especially working in low and middle income countries, I often feel like I'm pitching an insurance scheme, right? If we want to set up an emergency medical system, we're kind of couching it in terms of this is an insurance policy to prevent things from getting worse. How do you see these challenges playing out at the local level, and what kind of effective ways have you seen communities deal with this?
Yeah, and I think at the community level is where, in general, you see the most inspiring and the most important stories of success, because you don't have the benefit of distance from the disaster in those circumstances. And so you see a lot of coming together of different sectors and things like that. And of course, a lot of times the ones that make the news are the ugly town halls and the conflicts and things like that. But really, in my work, and I think a lot of folks who work in disasters, that is not really the norm. What you do see a lot more is folks saying, politics aside, how do we figure this out? Now, there are biases involved with that. Folks who have a seat at the table get a louder voice at times like that. And so issues of equity can be divided much wider, and there's as well too. But I think that, that how it plays out can vary at different levels. And so the importance of community representation and community involvement is really critical in any kind of understanding nationally or internationally or globally of the disaster experience. But to get to your question a little bit too, is, I think another piece to this is, we have to look at what's the value proposition that we use for investments in disaster. And, so long, especially I'm ashamed to say I'm as guilty of this as anyone, in the years after 9/11, it was, you got to do this, you're going to die, and your family's going to die. And so you got to do it now. And anyone who didn't, it's like, well, you just don't know, you're ignorant. I'll give an example, in the healthcare system, we'd point to Katrina and say, look at these hospitals, you could be next. And if we waited a few years, we would see the hospitals being shut down through changes in billing processes and reimbursement issues and things like that, and realize that hospitals were actually dealing with another existential crisis that didn't come from an earthquake or a hurricane. It came from the financial situation and the finances and the expense of healthcare. So at the same time, we didn't appreciate that disasters weren't the only thing that people have going on in their lives. And interestingly, some of the most attention to come from healthcare in the years after 9/11 and Katrina came when CMS, the Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements, there's a bunch of rules involved with that. And there was a new rule coming into focus that required a certain degree of preparedness and enumerated certain requirements for preparedness that hospitals had to do to be eligible for the reimbursements. All of a sudden, we had C-suite attention that grants could never do. Grants were seen as important. And at the time, I worked for a number of years for a healthcare system. And, preparedness was always taken seriously, don't get me wrong. But the level of attention that it was getting because of this change. And it turned out that I believe for the healthcare system I'd worked with, it was in the neighborhood of a third of the revenue came from those Medicare and Medicaid resources. And that's, different hospitals, it's more or less, but so all of a sudden that entire revenue stream could potentially be at risk by the way that the rule is being promoted. So we spent a lot of time sort of looking at and crosswalking, through Joint Commission accreditation, through other initiatives, that those tasks were already being done. But I mention this because I think it shows that, how we would explain this to a large business might be a little different than how we would explain it to an academic. And that's okay, right? The world that everyone lives in is driven by different incentives and different value propositions. And if we're asking someone to invest large sums of time and money into preparedness, we have to be able to articulate the value of that, and what that value is, and the vocabulary used to articulate that value is going to be different for different audiences. And so I know with some of the work that we're doing, and even in the way that I'm designing some of the classes that I teach, is to develop ways to sort of broaden the vocabulary, but also to broaden the empathy and for different audiences that you're working with, to realize what is the end result, what is the behavior change you want to achieve, and what is the pathway towards getting there, even if it's not necessarily, should it be about money? I don't know, probably not, but in a lot of cases it is. And just as another side note, being a center director and having to manage budgets, and including things that cover people's salaries, it's not something to just cast aside when you say it's about money, because there are jobs tied to that. There are livelihoods tied to that. It's no small thing to have to be in charge of someone else's job security.
Absolutely. It makes total sense. And I think that's very fascinating, yet at the same time, very predictable. You threaten somebody's income in the case of health systems, and well, you get their attention. And now all this change that seemed like it was so slow in coming is actually quite quick. Wish there would other ways they could get that through to folks, but that seems like one lever that the federal government is very effective at pulling. If there's one threat, one mega disaster that you're most concerned about domestically here in the United States, what would it be? What's the one that you're like, oh, this is the one that if it happens, we're all in trouble?
Yeah. So I think, and this is talked a little bit about in the book, and I believe it's Professor Adam Sobel who articulates this specifically. But one of the biggest catastrophes that keeps us up at night in the climate science community and the overlap with disasters is drought. So there are a lot of big high-profile disasters, hurricanes, wildfires are getting much worse, all sorts of things that are creating really, really intense, really devastating disasters. And of course, we're seeing in the news now the horribly devastating earthquake in Turkey and Syria, and a lot of the damage that that's caused. But drought is a slow-moving disaster. Drought is something that over time, it's like, what's the old saying? If you boil a frog, if you put it in room temperature water and gradually turn up the temperature, the frog will get boiled and won't even realize it. I don't know if that's true or not. Don't go boiling frogs or anything. Just it's not cool. But that's sort of what drought does to societies. Is each year gets tougher and tougher, and it affects the health and the mental health and the economic health of communities. And we're headed down a path of heat and drought and humidity where there are large swaths of the world that may be virtually uninhabitable without significant dependence on air conditioning, on climate control systems. And when you have things like crop failures in nation states that are already teetering on the brink, then you see more increased conflict. Now, you asked domestically, and the reason why I mention this domestically is we do have these vulnerabilities domestically, but even more so, we look at the immigration issues, particularly along the southern border. We look at humanitarian deployments and stress on the national security apparatus. So there's a series of dominoes that start to fall as these pressures are placed on other parts of the world that drives extraordinary climate migration and climate immigration that we're not ready for through our policies and through our thinking. There's also extraordinary pressures. Some of the most forward-thinking institutions on climate change and the impacts of associated disasters and risks is the military, is the national security apparatus, looking at the vulnerability of forces, the increased deployment, the increase in state instability driven by it. So these have things that will last for generations or longer if left unmitigated and if left unaddressed. And it's going to require a combination of both international policy, but also domestic policy on immigration, domestic policy on sort of how we operate as a nation, both with our internal food systems and where we live within the United States, but also some of the pressures coming and impacting us through global events.
That's really fascinating that you would say drought. That makes a whole lot of sense too. And I find it so interesting talking with folks from different countries, but particularly when you're talking about Europeans, the whole idea that in the United States that, if you own land that water passes through, you own that water, and how foreign a concept that is to other countries. I wonder, do you see that ever changing? Even now, as we're looking in the Colorado River, the Green River, they're all at, as I understand it, record low levels. Do you ever see that policy changing, or is that so embedded in American culture and society that it is what it is and it's not changing?
Wow, that's a really good question. I mean, on the one hand, I see the potential for everything to change, that it's just so many of these laws and rules, whether we're talking about water rights, whether we're talking about immigration, were built in a time that just does not exist anymore. The scarcity of resources, a lot of immigration policy was built based on economic development, right? And growing the population for growth and things like that. And so there's just a lot of things baked into these laws and baked into these rules that are just less relevant and certainly less within the context of the 21st century. And so I think everything's on the table. I think we're seeing that with the pandemic and with public health laws. Ironically, a lot of state constitutions and state public health laws were put in place during the time of yellow fever and smallpox and gave tremendous authority to public health officials to do what's needed to stop an outbreak. And now we're seeing a backlash against that in a lot of states. And we're seeing state constitutions being amended and laws being repealed to roll back some of that. And so I think that demonstrates that just because something has been on the books for decades and even centuries, does that math work out? For a long time, let's just say, that it's safe. And we have to remind ourselves that the world and the context in which these things were written don't necessarily apply anymore. And so at the very least, I think the books need to be reopened on this. Now, that being said, there's something unique about American culture, maybe not unique, but maybe more extreme than a lot of other places, that this was pioneer country, that this is where, individual rights and individual freedoms and the owning property is very fundamental to the creation of the nation. It's where people left other parts of the world to come to have those individual freedoms. And I do have a little bit of empathy, even during the pandemic, with policies that I don't agree with. But for many, many people, this individualism, this individual freedom is one of the most sacred things that they have. And it's a lot to ask them to give it up. And I think that we lose sight of that in a lot of the polarization that we have. And again, it's not just, we need to rethink all of our assumptions, but we also need to remember fundamentally kind of what these core beliefs are. And so, yeah, I'm sort of answering around the question because frankly, I have no idea, but I think everything's going to end up on the table. What actually changes and what doesn't is going to be subject to some very, to put it politely, vigorous debate from these different sort of poles that I've outlined.
Yeah, clearly that's a crystal ball nobody has, and we won't know until it happens for the most part. So you've got a new book coming out soon. I take it sometime this year. Share a little bit about that. What's the title of the new book and what's the focus?
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up. And it actually relates to some of the discussions that we've had. But the title of the book is Catastrophic Incentives: Why Our Approaches to Disasters Keep Falling Short. If you Google that right now, nothing's going to show up. It's in production now with our colleagues at Columbia University Press. And so there'll be more and more to see as the months continue. And I'm hoping later this year that'll be more widely available. But anyway, we're still going through we're at the very beginning of the production process. And anyone who's worked with academic presses, there's some process and some timelines involved. But it's co-authored with my colleague, Dr. Ellen Carlin at Georgetown University. And we've worked together. She came from the legislative side of things and also with the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense, where she was co-director for a number of years. And we've collaborated on a number of articles. And really, I think both share the frustration with when we're watching the news and we're seeing experts say, well, we couldn't have known. And, we're there, calling BS on it. And also just that to kind of get to the bottom of why there are all these issues. And early on in the pandemic, we had written a few op-eds and we were sort of lamenting how fundamental to all of these different sectors responding, there are business models, there are incentives that steer behavior one way instead of another. And that is driving so much of what we do. And so we decided to write a book. And we went to our colleagues at Columbia University Press, who were very gracious. We worked through the process and ultimately ended up under contract to write this forthcoming book. But essentially, the first half of the book looks at the different eras of disaster response as we've defined them from 9/11 until now. So to give a couple of examples, in the post 9/11 world, it was very security oriented, very homeland security, very terrorism focused. After around Hurricane Katrina, it sort of switched back to natural hazards focused and really looking at disasters like hurricanes and things like that. And we saw, H5N1 and then a lot of focus on pandemics. And so through each of those sort of eras, as we define them, we take a look at what was going on in the world, what were the kinds of disasters we were seeing, and how did 4 different sort of societal sectors respond? Industry, nonprofits, government, and academia. And in the second half of the book, we kind of break down each of those sectors and we look at, okay, why did they respond the way that they did? After 9/11, there was a huge number of degree programs coming onto the scene for Homeland Security degrees. There was a lot of money coming in. There was a lot of demand for it. And these programs were coming on board very, very quickly. Well, there's an incentive and a need for resources coming into academia, and there was a lot of money coming to do that. So there are sort of these market signals. These things don't get talked a lot about. And a lot of times we think, well, in academia, you just do what you think you should do and you follow the data where it goes. And in some circumstances, that's true, but there are these larger forces where you have to fund your work. I always tell folks at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, I think we're fortunate to have had great funders and do great work and work with great people. But I always say our strategy is what we want to do. Our funding is what we actually do. Now, our funding is, of course, a subset of what we want to do. We pursue projects we're passionate about and do them. But of course, there's more things that we think should be done and need to be done that might not necessarily be fundable by a government funder or in the interests of a mission-driven agency to do some exploratory research in an area that's not immediately viable. So these are things we have to contend with every day. And the purpose of the book is not to name and shame, not by a long shot, but is to really just help better understand what are these dynamics. And either we need to look at these incentives and see if we can alter them or rewire them, or better acknowledge and utilize these organizations for what they're built to do. I should also give a quick shout out. We do have some wonderful insights from yourself, Jason, of course, as you recall in the chapter on nonprofits and how nonprofits have to navigate this world. And it's very aspirational, and I think, very admirable, the work that you do and the work that nonprofits do to navigate this space. But there are very real pressures, right, that are experienced, and I know that you have to contend with funders, with host nations, with other parties that are an important part of the ability to do that work, and also creates constraints on what can be done versus what's needed.
So that's my next question. The dynamics of nonprofits in disaster response or even preparedness, it would seem to me, and I think others would share this, that at face value, you wouldn't want a nonprofit leading your disaster response efforts. But as we see so time and time again all over the world, it is often NGOs that are, or nonprofits for that matter, that are leading response efforts, especially in mega disasters. I mean, you mentioned, we're just watching the news right now about the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. And, one of the questions is, well, what about the government? Well, they were affected by the earthquake too, right? Government buildings don't get spared because they're the government. That was back in Haiti. Basically the entire UN apparatus collapsed in the earthquake, which really set back the response efforts. But I'm wondering, why is it that nonprofits play such a prominent role in disaster response? And do you think that that's a direction we should continue to be headed in?
Ooh, yeah. Jeez.
And you work for a nonprofit as well.
Yeah. Technically, Columbia University it's a not-for-profit 501c3. Like many universities, many healthcare systems. Absolutely. I think it's an interesting and important question. And we've done some writing on this as well too. But disaster researcher Russell Dines observed, I think the seminal paper was in 1970, the emergent behavior of organizations in disasters, and what you have at different types. And essentially, you have some that are built to respond, and you expect to respond. Emergency management, first responders, Red Cross, sort of pre-established, ready to go organizations. And then you have varying degrees of emergence and extension. Some organizations, like faith-based, might extend their reach into the community and take on new tasks. And the furthest along are these ones that completely emerge in a disaster. They didn't exist before a disaster. And oftentimes they emerge because no one else is doing it. There's a community need and no one else is doing this. I mention this because in our observations and some of the work we've done in disaster areas, the type ones are there, the large nonprofits, the response agencies, and they're there and they have pre-established contracts and rules of engagement. But the larger they are, the more the impact to the brand and the brand's ability to do work is a risk factor that they need to consider. And so it makes it harder to do things that you don't have a protocol for, even if you see a need for, the more that brand risk is kind of factored into it. And again, I'm not judging this. This is just an important reality here. And so what you'll see other maybe smaller nonprofits who are a little more nimble, but don't have the ability to gain resources and to do these things. So for question one, I think maybe it was question two, but anyway, I think so. Nonprofits serve a role. There's a gap between what government does, what the private sector does, and what people need. And nonprofits either are pre-positioned to do that or they emerge to do it. And so I think that there's something very important to that there's always going to be gaps. And nonprofits by definition are meant to meet that need. But I'm going to probably get myself in a little bit of trouble here and say that, nonprofit is a massive industry, and it's only been made bigger by the amount of disasters and the amount of money flowing to disasters, whether through individual donors, through corporate donors, through government contracts to do work. And it creates an industry that can have behaviors not unlike for-profit industries, which are sort of optimize around where the most money is and maybe move away from areas that are less funded, including areas like preparedness and mitigation that are tougher to fund, that are tougher to find donors for. And so this is a very real dynamic. And again, I'm not trying to be critical the organizations themselves, but we have to understand that there are market forces at play in sectors where we might not necessarily intuitively think that there are market forces at play. So I think that there is a need to sort of rethink our work with the role of nonprofits. Maybe rethink is a strong word, but to better refine the evaluation of nonprofits, the role of nonprofits, to really sort of refine the reliance on them, especially in international settings, but also in domestic settings. Our government's let off the hook too much because of well-financed nonprofits. There are just a lot of dynamics here that are very necessary in the immediacy of the response to save lives and livelihoods, but in the long run, maybe contributing to an environment that creates suboptimal government response, and it might not be the right balance. It's just a very fascinating dynamic, and it's one we explore a lot in the book, Dr. Ellen Carlin and myself, in our forthcoming book, to try to better understand this dynamic and sort of see how it's played out in different contexts. So I don't have a definitive answer, but as you can tell, I think I'm uneasy with the status quo, but I also don't want to go for the cheap shot and deny all of the great and important work that's done every day.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you'd also recognize that the whole nonprofit sector is not exclusively, but is very heavy to the United States, right? I don't know what the exact number is, but in terms of philanthropic giving, donations by individuals to nonprofits, a very large share of it happens in the United States, which is very much a part of our national character, which is to be very suspicious of the government, right? We'll take care of ourselves. Thank you very much. Get your government hands out of here. So I think that, the nonprofit question is very particular, or maybe the better word is there's a huge emphasis on it in the United States in particular because of the way things have worked here for a couple hundred years now.
Yeah, and there's also a large trust element too. And that's one of the other things, and it's why it's somewhat understandable that large brands that have a lot of trust in their brand, that's where corporations, wealthy individuals who want to have an impact go to, so that they don't have to understand all the nuances, but they know that if they give the money to this trusted entity, it'll get where it needs to go. I will say too, something that I've observed domestically and internationally is a lot of smaller community nonprofits. There's sort of two dynamics. One is the gold standard, which is where they really emerge and do amazing work and do things that no one else is doing. But then what happens after the disaster? So a quick example, we were down in Texas in Hurricane Harvey, and there was this relief camp that had set up very organically, definitely one of these emergent organizations, from a business owner who just their property hadn't been severely damaged and ended up as an impromptu refugee camp, as they called it, for those who are out of their homes from Hurricane Harvey. They actually registered as a 501c3 through some of the philanthropic donations of celebrities. We helped with some of that process. And I was talking to the person who was running it, and she said something that stands out to this day because I'm talking about it. She said, I'm going to do this for 2 years and then I'm done. I'm not setting up a long-term nonprofit. This is going to have to be absorbed back into the social aid structure of the community. I'm not setting this up to be long-term. And what struck me with that was that she had built a nonprofit and didn't get enamored by the money that was coming immediately after the disaster and say, oh, this is what I'm going to do now forever. It was, this need is going to wane, and ultimately this needs to get woven back into the support systems of the community. And there were a couple of other groups who worked with down there too who had similar approaches. And I thought that was really important, because a lot of times what we'll see too is we'll see a large disaster and we'll see nonprofits that sort of emerge and then make a business plan to be a permanent nonprofit. And then as years go by and the funding wanes, a lot of them go under, or a lot of them become, and we see this in humanitarian development, where there's just this constant dependence, where, entrepreneurialism is setting up a nonprofit, especially I did my practicum in Ghana, and was in sort of an interesting environment, invited into someone's home under the auspices of just being friendly, and it was a friend of a friend, and then ended up being pitched donations to this nonprofit, this NGO that they had set up. And it just felt more like a Shark Tank, like a business proposition. And again, I'm not trying to throw shade at people trying to do what they got to do to further their lives and do more, but that sticks out to me as how this economy has been created among NGOs and among nonprofits. And these are important to always have as safety nets in civil society. But again, there's something, I have an uneasiness about the size and scope and dependence and some of the dynamics, again, without wanting to take away from the vitalness of it during disasters as well as after disasters.
I could certainly attest to that. I've seen a lot of that where, in fact, governments become dependent on the nonprofits to do the work that they're not doing themselves. And whether that's, oh, we're so grateful they're doing this work for us, or great, we don't have to do it now. The nonprofits will take care of it. There's certainly a lot of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry to jump in. I had a conversation. I'm going to try and be careful not to say where, but it was with a public safety agency and a foundation, and then there was the government funding, and all of it was an equipment heavy organization. But it turned out that most of the equipment and most of the life-saving equipment that they had was bought by this foundation, which relied on donors. And the money that came from the municipality primarily really only went to salaries in the pension fund. And I asked the foundation, should you be doing this? Like, I mean, I understand it's really important and I'm glad you're doing this, but should you be doing this? And they said, the board asked them that all the time. But the reality is that they weren't going to get the money. And so if they didn't do it, these responders wouldn't have what they need to be safe and to be alive. And I think back on that all the time because I'm thinking, this is one of those things where anyone looking at the street and seeing the lights and sirens on this vehicle is going to think the municipality paid for that, and they didn't. And so I think the investment of individuals and businesses in the functioning of civil society that actual investment through the tax base might not actually be reflected. I don't know if I'm how to say this otherwise. I was just, frankly, I just to this day, it just boggles my mind that I could be looking at this response vehicle with the municipality's name on it and they didn't pay for it. That they were barely covering the salaries of the people on it. And this was not a small jurisdiction, not by a long shot. So it's exactly to your point. And I would say that this isn't not only an international phenomenon, it's a domestic phenomenon as well, too, that there's a dependence on donors that is probably not, I mean, we take for granted that it's always there, but a big economic downturn or something that, has people tighten up their wallets means some of these things we rely on in civil society might not be there because they're not actually baked into the governance of it. We rely on the generosity of others to do a job that we think the government is doing.
Oh, yeah. We've run into that ourselves. It's why is this nonprofit supporting the public emergency communication system, right? And then we're in the position of saying, well, we know full well that if we stop supporting it, it's going to go away. And that there's some weight, the moral weight there, you feel some responsibility for it, and very complicated questions,
Yeah, and I certainly feel like it's hard to throw shade at any player in this because the agency is just trying to do a job. The nonprofit is filling a need that's not there. Even on the political side, are you going to raise everyone's taxes by an amount to pay for something that they already see is there? It sort of paints you into a corner. And there's a fragility within all that. So it's I think understanding these underlying business models is really important to sort of understand what drives our decisions and drives our decisions to do what we do in the way that we do them. But it also exposes some underlying weaknesses as well as potentially some strengths that are maybe very different than the way we perceive the arrangement of these sectors as they're oriented in disasters. Pre, during, and post.
Wow, this is heavy stuff. Yeah, I feel like I could talk to you. I mean, I know I could talk to you about this for the next 2-3 hours, but in the end, I don't know if we're going to solve them all now, but I'm sure grateful that you are working on this because this is important stuff. So you've got the new book coming out this year. What's next for you and what's next for the National Center for Disaster Preparedness?
Yeah, I think with, as we talk about all these challenges we face in disaster preparedness, I think everyone involved, including ourselves, but not limited to us, sort of knows to a certain extent where the challenges are and how do we do this better. And so I would also try to end on a slightly positive note that I think everyone involved in all of these sort of scenarios for the most part, is striving to do better and to figure out how to crack the code on how to do better. Now, for our part, we're sort of growing on a couple of different fronts. Our training and education side and the diversity and the types of trainings, whether responder trainings or executive education. We're participating in more and more executive education for groups in the private sector that are involved with some of these levers of change and how investments are calculated to be better informed by the value of resilience and the value of things like equity, but also in training the next generation of leaders with a lot of the skills we wish we had at the time, whether it's in pre-college programs or in college programs, including some degree granting courses or some courses on degree granting programs through the climate school. But I'd say at the end of the day, it's having an open mind and seeking out partnerships, seeking out people who operate in worlds that are maybe near ours, but not in ours, so that we can better learn. How can we as academics do a better job of generating research as well as translating that research in forms that are useful to the good work that really everyone involved, including in government, including in industry, including in nonprofits, and including in academia, are seeking to do to build more resilience and ultimately crack the code on what is this ideal structure and ideal approach to disasters.
You know, it reminds me of, I was at a conference, the World Association of Disaster and Emergency Medicine, and they introduced a gentleman and they said he's an expert in disaster response. And when he got to the podium, he said, thank you very much for the kind words, but I will have to decline the introduction. He goes, nobody's an expert in disaster response because we've never gotten it right. And I thought that was funny, but I also thought, man, we're really setting the bar high for ourselves, because in the end, all of these disasters can overwhelm us so easily, right? I mean, it's like trying to hold the seat back. At some point, you're going to be overwhelmed and your resources are going to be exhausted. So it's more a matter of doing what you can with what you have. And I thank you and everyone that you work with for the awesome work that you're doing. It's so important, and just peeling back the curtain a little bit on all of this helps a lot of people understand it so much better and get to a better place where they can make decisions and figure out the plan forward. So thank you, Jeff, for all the work you do and your colleagues at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness.
No, I appreciate that very much, and likewise to you and your team, and to all of the listeners as well too. We stand on the shoulders of really some amazing work that folks do in communities and in institutions throughout civil society, and try to work hand in hand to better the future of the world that we're in. And so it's really although disasters themselves are very challenging events, the type of intersections, the people coming together, it can be very inspiring work. And certainly I'm grateful to work with the folks that I do, both within the center and beyond the center, through partnerships like yourselves and your listeners. So thank you for having me, and thanks for helping to shine a light on a lot of these important discussions.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jeff. Really enjoyed it.
All right. Thank you.